Hello again. This is my third video. Let's call it episode 3. And usually I use specific examples from what's going on in the news, what's going on in today's society, what's being reported on, and then I give you some context, I give you some information that helps make sure you understand the framework within which it is being given to you. But today I want to do something a little different. I want to talk specifically about propaganda. The reason why is basically democracy, which is the system that we're all supposed to look at as if it is a shining city on the hill, has a flaw. And democracy's flaw is that it is a popularity contest. Now, that's good if people are educated. That's good if the people who are voting are actually understanding the world around them, understand the information, have vetted it, have looked at various sources and said, this one I can trust X amount, and this one I can trust X amount, so I'll do something in the middle. The problem is, in today's society, that doesn't exist anymore. We are not talking about a world in which people understand anything. 15% of Americans get their news from TikTok. Not just social media. I mean, social media would be bad enough, but we're specifically talking about TikTok. To remind you, TikTok is the platform that made all the American kids think bin Laden was pretty awesome. So that's a real problem. And by the way, 15% is talking about all Americans, not just young people. It's not. 15% of all Americans. If we say, what about the young people, like 18 to 29, we're talking about over 30%. Which is a 255% increase since 2020. So because social media and TikTok in particular, the most vile, the most problematic of all of the social media sites, has become the place most people get their news, we have to talk about propaganda. Propaganda is one of those things that takes the democratic system, the popularity contest, and makes it a real issue, because now anything that you're being pumped full of, lies, misinformation, selective information, becomes the reason you are going to vote and the reason you're going to think what you think. It's also the reason you are going to go march on a college campus, the reason you are going to call for the genocide of the Jews, which, don't worry, Harvard, Penn, and MIT have no problem with. I get asked all the time, why are the Jews seen as the bad guy in this equation? It's a great question, and it's mind-boggling. Why is it mind-boggling? Because if you just take a step back and forget all of the propaganda and forget all of the history of Jew hatred and forget everything else, let's even do the old psychological trick of taking out the names. Let's take out the name Jew, let's take out the name Muslim, let's take out the name Palestinian, let's take out the name Israeli, and let's just say Group A and Group B. So Group A is a group that has been persecuted time and time and time again. They're usually the peaceful group. They're the ones that aren't proselytizing, aren't going out there and trying to convert everybody to their ideology. They're just trying to live their life. They're just trying to live their life with their own traditions, with their own language, with their own culture, amongst their own people, in their homeland that they've been in since basically everybody was in a place. So that group keeps getting attacked. They keep getting persecuted. They keep getting killed. People keep trying to get them to convert to other religions. Whatever Group A is, I don't know. It's just Group A. So that group, peaceful, quiet, attacked victims, essentially. That's Group A. Group B, the most colonizing group in the history of mankind. This particular group, Group B, whoever that is, also in their holy book, has a bunch of stuff that basically says, kill everybody that isn't us. It even says that if you die in the process of killing the, let's say, infidel, then you're going to go to, let's say, paradise. So the idea of killing yourself, killing others, killing your children, all A-okay within Group B. Also, of all the groups that exist, the Group A's, the Group B's, and even the Group C through Z, this group happens to be kind of problematic when it comes to terrorism, problematic when it comes to women's rights, problematic when it comes to gay rights, problematic when it comes to minority rights, problematic when it comes to anybody who isn't them rights. They also have done a bunch of terroristic attacks throughout history. They have been known as the group to hijack airplanes, to behead people, to fly planes into buildings, whoever Group B is. So now we have Group A, the victim, quiet, want to be left alone group, and Group B, the violent, torturous, murderous, sometimes rapist, female oppressive, gay oppressive, often terrorist group. So, okay, those are the two groups. Let's not say which is which. That way we won't have any kind of bias. Which group do you think you should be behind? It's really tough. So with that in mind, why is it that so often, and especially these days, the world seems to villainize Group A, the quiet victim? Weird that they would be the ones who are villainized. Well, let's add something else to Group A. They also are tired of taking this shit. So after decades and centuries and millennia of being the victim, they finally said, you know what? Nobody else is helping us stop being the victim. So we're going to build up our own army and we're going to fight back. And so when someone does something to us, we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. When we see armies from a bunch of different countries trying to kill us, we may even preemptively strike to stop them from doing so. And that is the thing that pisses people off about Group A. They won't just fucking die. But is that enough? Is that enough to make Group A the villain? By the way, spoiler alert, Group A is the Jews. I know, you're shocked. So why would Group A, the Jews, the quiet group that wants to be left alone, that's been attacked time and time and time again throughout history, and finally decided to defend themselves? Their army is even called the Israeli Defense Force, not the Israeli Attack Force. On their emblem, they have two olive branches, which means peace. On this side, they have two swords, which means murder. So what is it that makes the Jews the villains in the eyes of so many morons, like the people marching on college campuses, like the thousands of people that took to the streets, like the presidents of some of our most elite universities? Propaganda. The answer is propaganda. So let's talk about what propaganda is, how pervasive it is, and how it works. And we're going to use specific examples from this situation, from the Middle East, from Israel, from Gaza, to explain exactly what's happening and why so many people are brainwashed into believing the big lies. Let's begin with size. There is this almost laughable narrative that postage stamp sized Israel, it's like the size of New Jersey. I just want to make sure you understand that it is surrounded by Arab countries and Muslim countries that hate it and want to kill it. Their size is this. Israel's size is this. And again, when you look at it just from a size perspective, when you just look at a map, again, you think, how can this tiny thing that looks like a splinter be the bad guy in this equation when the Death Star is hanging over the top of it? It looks like the opening of Star Wars with that ship that just goes on and on and on, the Muslim ship, and then one little going by, and you're like, oh, the boom is the bad guy. It doesn't make any sense. Let's talk about why the tiniest place is the majority oppressing the minority. This is exactly what propaganda is designed for, especially when it is force-fed to the gullible, the biased, or the uninformed, or any combination of those three. For some clarity, let's talk about some stats. I love giving you numbers because numbers are irrefutable. Jews make up 0.2% of the world's population. I want to say it again, not 1%, not 2%, 0.2%. Infinitesimally small. Muslims make up 25% of the world's population. Fully 1/4 of the world's population are Muslim. Wowzers, that's a lot. And we're talking about billions versus millions, literally about 2 billion people versus about 15 million people. Listen to those numbers again and tell me that it makes any sense that the 15 million is going to be the big bad versus the 2 billion. It would be like those 300 guys from Sparta going up against the Persian army, and you're thinking, oh man, that Persian army is in real trouble because the 300 bad guys are coming. My brain can't even accept that other people think this. For anyone to believe that the Jews are the big bad, that the Jews are the Goliath versus the David of the Muslims, you have to buy into the fact that the 15 million of us, and let's be more specific, the 6 million Jews that are actually in Israel are the ultimate power in the region. And when I say region, I mean the Middle East, a place so overrun by Arab Muslims that if you look at a map, you almost can't see the state of Israel. Every time I want to show my daughter where she was born, I have to magnifying glass the thing. So let's play straw man for a minute. Whoa, wait a minute. Whoa, you're talking about all the Arab Muslims. That's not the conversation that we're having. I'm being the straw man. We're talking about the Palestinian people. Aren't they smaller? Isn't that like just 2 million people? So now we're talking about 6 million Jews versus 2 million Palestinians. Doesn't that make them the underdog? If you buy into that, then that's just more propaganda at work. For comparison, if you are a part of a larger group that makes up the majority, even though you are one person or one family or one neighborhood, you still are part of the majority. Saying the Palestinians are separate from the Muslims or separate from the Arab countries is the equivalent of saying that someone who is about to go into a fight against 20 guys, you're like, whoa, one guy against against 20 guys. This fist fight is going to be a bloodbath. But what you didn't know is there's 200 guys in the other room that once the fight starts are going to come in and have that one guy's back. And suddenly it's 200 against 20. So that guy you thought was the underdog isn't. He just looked like the underdog because he was standing alone in the bar when the fight started. The whole concept is absurd on its face. And if you don't believe me, go ahead and take a look at what happened once the war with Hamas started. Who got involved? Hezbollah, Iran, the Houthis, Lebanon, and believe me, more and more are going to join the fight. You even had Saudi Arabia, who was about to sign something with Israel, and of course, many people believe that's why Hamas attacked when they did. They not only pulled out of signing, they also condemned Israel for what they were doing, which may not be boots on the ground, but believe me, is part of the war effort. As if that's not enough, you have Egypt and Jordan who could easily take in the Palestinians, both from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but choose not to because if they're taken in, there's no fight anymore. There's nobody to oppress. There's none of that small little Palestinian people. But because they're not taking in their brothers and sisters who are Muslims and Arabs, because they're not doing that, they are also contributing to the fight. Because now they are saying, in not doing so, we can villainize Israel for the attack while not helping our people at all. Let's go back to me being a straw man for a minute. I understand you say all those other people are going to help them, all those other groups, but they're alone. They're locked into a small strip of land. In fact, not only do they have no allies in that strip of land, they can't even get goods and services and aid. And Egypt won't take them in. Jordan won't take them in. None of the billions of the other Arabs and Muslims will take them in. So maybe they're not really part of the greater majority, which is a little more propaganda to pull at your heartstrings. So how do you know that the Gazans are actually just a pawn being used by all the people who, I mean, let's be real, don't give a shit about Gaza or the Palestinians. They're just other Muslims, and they're using them in order to make Israel look bad to the rest of the world and to the useful idiots who are going to march in America and wherever else on behalf of this oppressed little minority, which brings us to our next point. Let's talk about those people being, as they are labeled, refugees. There are 2 million of them, this small little group. And actually, there were 700,000 of them at the time that some of this happened. In the UN, they have 2 committees that are solely dedicated to the Palestinian people. One was established in 1949, immediately following the establishment of the State of Israel, where those 700,000 people that were supposedly displaced, and some of them were, by the way, displaced, even though they were offered full citizenship and decided not to take it because they didn't like Israel and didn't want to share. They only wanted all of it and for the Israelis to be dead. So they said no and then became refugees. So the UNRWA was established, and they are supposed to place these displaced people to help find them a new home. We're going to get into the UNRWA in a little bit, but I'll give you a little preview. When the hostages were taken by Hamas, one of them was held by a UNRWA teacher, an employee of the UN, in their attic, holding a hostage. Good job, UN. As always, you cesspool of vile garbage. The second thing was in 1975, they established the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of Palestinian People. That was established by the General Assembly, 1975. So now they have 2 groups that work specifically for the Palestinians. Now, what does that have to do with all this propaganda I'm talking about? Well, let's talk about what a refugee is. The definition of refugee, according to the UN, is someone who has been forced to flee conflict or persecution and has crossed an international border to seek safety. Let's begin with the fact that they are still in Israel. So they have not crossed an international border, but let's put that aside because yes, they were moved into another area. That's number 1. Number 2 is they cannot return to their country without risking their life or their freedom. Let's go back to the UN and see, how is refugee status canceled? How is that status revoked? Number 1, you have voluntarily re-availed yourself of the protection of the country of your citizenship. Number 2, if you have lost your citizenship in that initial country from which you are a refugee and you have had it reinstated, or you have gone to a new country and enjoy the protection of that country. Number 3, you have voluntarily returned to the country you had left or fled due to the fear of being persecuted. Number 4, you can no longer refuse to avail yourself of the protection of the country of your citizenship because the circumstances under which you originally were kicked out, or you were a refugee, or you fled, or you left no longer apply. And finally, you just don't want to be one anymore. You have a personal reason. You don't want to be known as a refugee anymore. You want to have a little self-determination. You want to stand on your own 2 feet wherever it is that you're going and no longer be seen as simply a refugee or an asylum seeker. That's the UN's rules. So why? 75 years later, when they have their own spot that is run by their own government with their own military, where they hold their own elections, are they still considered refugees? There are no refugees anywhere else in the world that still qualify as refugees that live the way the Palestinian people do, even though they still retain that status. They are generations removed from the group that originally were refugees, number one. Number two, they live in built-up cities with an infrastructure. And number three, they live in their own land under their own government. No other refugee in the world retains that status, but they do. And why is that? Because they have honeycombed themselves into the United Nations as part of the UNRWA and make sure by mandate that they remain refugees. That word is really important because it sounds like a victim. It sounds like someone I have to pity. So the minute they lose refugee status, the minute they can't be called on the news, legally speaking, refugees, suddenly the sympathy goes from here to here. So they made sure that word was still in play, even though it didn't apply. They are literally the only ones in the entire world, in the entire history of the world, that retain refugee status despite them not qualifying under any legal definition of refugee. And look no further than that teary-eyed sympathy at work than recently when a refugee camp that the terrorists were using as a base of operation to launch rockets at Israeli civilians was hit by Israeli fire. Those headlines were brutal because they made it sound like this mighty Israeli military was firing upon a refugee camp. Think of what that sounds like. It's like a big man kicking a puppy. But that so-called refugee camp was actually a modern apartment building in a modern neighborhood. How is that a refugee camp? I don't know. Neither do you, and neither does anybody else. But the UNRWA knows because they wrote the law. Again, nowhere else in the world, in the history of mankind, has a built-up apartment building in a built-up neighborhood been called a refugee camp, except for the Palestinians. Now I'll be the straw man again. Well, I don't believe what you're saying. I'm going to doubt you because there's got to be legal standards for this. There's got to be some definition by which we have to adhere to. They can't just make it up as they go along, can they? But you're forgetting. We're talking about the United Nations, a corrupt Jew-hating organization where out of every 20 resolutions, 17 of them are against Israel. An organization that still hasn't called Hamas a terrorist group. In fact, there are senators right now that are putting pressure on the UN. Please sanction them. Please call them a terrorist group. Don't just say, we don't like what you did. We don't like that you have a bunch of hostages, even though some of our own people are holding them in their attics. We don't like it, but we won't actually put anything on the books about that. In fact, as of only 2 weeks ago, the UN was still pressuring Israel to stop fighting back against this terroristic group that not only murdered over 1,000 people, but promised to do it again and again. That's the UN. So when you ask, what about the definitions? The definitions are written by the UN. The UN, who established a group that was meant to resettle those Muslims and those Arabs who were displaced in 1948, and deliberately, instead of resettling them, worked hard to make sure they never got resettled, made sure that they always held on to their keys to their old houses as some sort of symbol of never letting shit go. Made sure that their refugee status was in concrete until the state of Israel is decimated, which is not what a refugee is meant to be. But the UN sucks, and these guys write the dictionary. So they decided for this particular group, because we hate this particular group, we're going to let you do whatever you want with words. That's insanity, but that's something that many people believe. I'm pointing the finger at you because hopefully some of you are people that believed it, and now that you hear this, might start thinking, maybe I've been misinformed. Speaking of dictionary and words and definitions, let's talk about labels, another way that propaganda gets a foothold in the mind of the stupid, the gullible, the uninformed. And by the way, I'm not trying to insult any of you. Those of you who believe these incorrect things, I'm not trying to say you are a problem. Some of you are, sure. But many of you are just the misinformed category, which doesn't make you a bad person. In fact, if you're watching this and you think Israel is the bad guy, you already should be commended, because it means you have at least this much of your mind open to listening to the other side of the equation and maybe changing what you think. I have received in the last 2 videos email upon email and phone call upon phone call from people saying, I didn't know that. I didn't know that that's how the United Nations worked. I always listen to Amnesty International, for instance. People's minds can be changed. That's why I'm doing this. So let's talk labels. I'm going to ask you a rhetorical question because you can't answer back. What is the name of those who recently committed genocidal acts against the Jews living in the south of Israel and are currently at war with Israel? Is it Palestine? Is it the Palestinians? Is it Gaza? Is it the Gazans? Is it Arabs? Is it the Muslims? Any of you who answered those things are wrong. It is none of those things. Why? Because there is a very specific name in the common parlance that we have applied to this particular group of people. Although all of those things are correct. It is Palestine, it is the Palestinians, it is Gaza, it is the Gazans, it is the Arabs, and it is the Muslims. But no, the world has called them by their chosen name, their preferred pronoun. Hamas. As if that's not enough, the terrorist organization known as Hamas has started to compartmentalize their different departments. For instance, they have a military wing, as if there's some part of Hamas that's just a book club. They have done this compartmentalization thing so that if you're blaming this part over here can get whitewashed. And we're not just talking about within Hamas, we're talking about the whole group, all of the Gazans, all of the Muslims, all of the Arabs. Nope, it's none of that. It's just the armed group over here. So this part, you better make sure you don't say anything about, or else you're a racist. And for those of you mad about my preferred pronoun joke, I'm going to tell you something that might change your mind. A Muslim PR agency contacted the press after the Palestinian terrorists committed Holocaust 2.0 on October 7th. They talked to the reporters and they instructed them to be sure to ask how the people who committed that act wanted to identify. That's a quote. It's not a joke. In other words, they literally said, we prefer to be called freedom fighters. We prefer to be called resistant combatants. We prefer to be called oppressed people fighting back, rising up. And if you ever listen to a group speak, like the SWIL, known as CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is 100% a terrorist adjacent group, working with terrorists every day. And by the way, that's documented. Come at me. A group designed to fight stereotypes that were coming at Muslims and Arabs, but instead does everything in their power to just vilify Jews, badmouth Jews, and make sure the Muslims look like innocent victims in the whole thing. So basically, CARE, just another arm of Hamas. One of them gave a speech this week that said, we were so happy to see our brothers and sisters break free of their concentration camp on October 7th and fight back against the oppressor, take back their rights, walk freely in their own homeland. That's how they qualified the murder of 1,200 people, the rape of women, the burning of babies, just walking in their free land, breaking free from their concentration camp. That's all it was to them. And that's the propaganda they keep pumping into your veins. So knowing that Hamas wanted to be known as freedom fighters, and when the reporters kowtowed to them for various reasons, Jew hatred, they did ask. And often they did write those things. In fact, certain organizations like the BBC, for instance, said, we won't say terrorist because that's an opinion, guys. And when that stuff went out over the internet, some of the stupider people or more gullible people or people who were looking for a reason to hate Jews anyway, on the receiving end of this information, bought it. Some of the press bought it. And the press, always on the lookout for a way to hurt the Jewish people, wrote exactly those things. They wrote freedom fighter, they wrote resistance, they wrote armed wing of Hamas, they wrote all of those things. But as a philosophy teacher of mine told me many years ago, you can call a dog's tail its leg, but it still has 4 legs because that thing is a tail no matter what you call it. But let's go bigger. Let's go beyond Hamas. Let's go beyond the Palestinians. Let's go beyond Gaza. When you look at the larger assemblage, It goes even further than that. Think of it this way. Groups that have the same demographics, the same ultimate goal, the same tactics, the same ethnic makeup, the same religious makeup, even come from the same region often, usually those groups would share a classification. But what we have done, again, semantically, is separate each of them out so that one can do one thing while another's doing another thing, and we can blame this one, but not this one. And that way, everybody gets to be an innocent victim while the other one does exactly the thing that they all want to do. It allows them to spread the blame around. Look no further than the Islamic Jihad being the one that launched the rocket that hit the supposed hospital, but it turned out it was just a parking lot, murdering 500 people, but it turned out it was a dozen. That wasn't Hamas. Oh, so when we're doing our ceasefires with Hamas, everybody else still gets to launch rockets because they ain't us. You want your hostages back? We'd love to, but some of them were taken by this other group, and we don't know where they are, even though we're all working towards the same goal, and we all have the same tactics, and we all come from the same place, and we all have the same religious and ethnic makeup, and we're all doing the exact same thing. It's not us, even if we collaborate. Even if we talk to one another, even if we occasionally join forces, even if we really are the same group, we're not. You know that because we have two different names, you see. Now, I can't go through all the names, but let's just do a couple of them. ISIS, the Islamic Resistance, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, IS-K, the Muslim Brotherhood, ISIL, ISIS, the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, and countless others. All of the groups that I just mentioned are the same group. All of them have the same ideology. All of them have the same tactics. You're seeing beheadings happen in Afghanistan in the same way you're seeing beheadings happen on October 7th. It's the exact same thing, the same brutality, the same rape, the same burning people alive. In 1929, when the massacre happened in Hebron, it's the exact same story that happened on October 7th. And this was before 1948, before Israel was a state. So you can't blame it on the same bullshit you blame it on today. So what happened? Well, the Mufti of Jerusalem, known as Haj Amin al-Husseini, decided he wanted to assert Muslim dominance over, as usual, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Western Wall, the entire Temple Mount. He sent in his people to decimate, murder, rape, torture, and kill all the people in Hebron. First, the Muslim preachers told all of their flock, I want my Muslim faithful to fight against the Jews until the last drop of blood. And by the next morning, the Arabs arrived in Hebron with axes, with knives, with sharpened shovels. They walked into a house, murdered 2 young boys, and then bludgeoned to death everyone else in the home. And then they systematically went from home to home and did exactly the same stuff that we saw on October 7th. They burned people alive. They raped people. There's a story of one woman whose hands were cut off and then was left to die from the pain in the street. That group wasn't called Hamas. It was before Hamas existed. That group wasn't called ISIS. They weren't called Al-Qaeda. They were just a group of Muslims who hated Jews and decided to kill them, as all of these other groups are. And every day I feel like I hear about a new Muslim group. How about Al-Shabaab, for instance, which operates in Somalia? Are they different? Well, they often are referred to as Hamas adjacent or ISIS aligned. They're the same thing in a different place. As someone said to me yesterday, old hate, new name. So what does it mean that they all have these different names? Does that mean they all have different allegiances? It's silly. It would be like me changing my last name to Zingarella and pretending my family got smaller because I named myself something new. So here I am again, being the straw man. All right. But don't these groups hate each other? I have been reliably told. I've read countless think pieces about how different these organizations are. In fact, I just read an article by the Brookings Institute, a very well-known organization that tells me about all the differences and all the hate they have for each other. How do you explain that, smart guy? Fair enough. Great question, straw man. So let's talk about it. I read those articles too, especially the one from the Brookings Institute that has been cited countless times to show us that these are not the same group, that they're all different, that what I'm saying is probably racist or something. But if you honestly and in good faith actually look at what they say about each of these organizations, you will find that they are exactly the same. The ideology is the same, the methods are the same, all the things I've mentioned are the same. So why are they named different things? Why are we supposed to think that these are all different groups? The big difference is who gets to be in charge after the destruction of the Western world? When they win, who gets to sit on the throne of the Muslim empire? You see, their goals are still the destruction collectively of the state of Israel, the murder of all the Jews. They also all want a caliphate. They also all want death to America. They also want anybody who isn't a Muslim to either become a Muslim or die or be their slaves. Yes, still today, all of you social justice warriors, they keep slaves. Anyway, as it stands now, each people, each organization, each government, each country, they all have their own names. And in order to be accurate, we have to use all of them. It's politically incorrect to call someone from Al-Qaeda someone from ISIS. We are admonished for it, in fact. And therefore, it would be politically incorrect for me to say that the same people who flew planes into buildings on 9/11 in America also cut off Daniel Pearl's head in Afghanistan and also committed a second Holocaust in Israel on October 7th. It would be accurate, to be sure, but it wouldn't be politically correct. And that, today, is a sin. Now, before I move on, I want to point out something. Israel does not have this. No part of Israel or Jewish society has this. Israel, who are terrible at PR, must have skipped public perception and manipulation class because they kept it honest. They kept it real. They have one name, Israel. The government, Israel. The military, Israel. The left-wing people, Israel. The right-wing people, Israel. The men, Israel. The women, Israel. The defenseless babies, you got it, Israel. So if they're all Israel, as the Muslims tell us time and again, they are all oppressors, they are all colonizers, they are all at fault. And some people use this in order to criticize the country. Like, for instance, the exalted Jew Bernie Sanders, so Jewish, he's like a catfish sandwich smothered in pork rinds. And that man often says that he hates Netanyahu. Notice that when he criticizes the current government, I'm talking about right now government of Israel, he says the Netanyahu government of Israel. But right now, Netanyahu is not running the government. It is a coalition government because the country is at war. And both sides of the political aisle are represented. But he can't say that because then he admits he has a problem with Jews, with Israel, that he's a self-hater, that he's ignorant. Instead, he falls back on saying Netanyahu government, and that way he can just say Israel bad, and I want not to send them money, which is what he tried recently to do when he was trying to veto Chuck Schumer's proposed bill. So this is a major problem for Israel on the PR front, on the social media front, on the propaganda and manipulation front. There is no distinction on the world stage between the army, the Holocaust survivor, the infant, the prime minister, and the protester marching against the prime minister. They're all Israel, which means there's no escaping the blame. It also means that punishment in the eyes of those who deem themselves Israel's enemies are deserved equally by all of the above. And if you don't believe that, check out the number of people who heard babies were carved out of their mothers' bellies and decapitated in front of them and said, and I'm quoting, I swear to God, I didn't make this up. It sounds like something that a psychopath would have written, but I'm quoting. I'm going to read it. What did you think revolution was going to look like? You see, smart as they are, Jews never figured out how to wage a proper PR war. When I was a kid, I used to ask my father, how come when I'm watching the news, it's always this beautifully manicured, the bespoke suit, perfectly coiffed, British accent, educated at Oxford, Muslim guy. And on the other side is a big, fat, sweaty guy. His buttons were maybe one off. The tie is askew. He's got short sleeves on. His hair is a mess. And he's got this thick accent. You know how you do the baba. That's the Israeli. It reminds me of the Nixon-Kennedy debate, where one person had good information, but the other one looked good on camera. Part of it is that Jews and Israel were too trusting. We think that it's obvious that we are the good guys, and it should be, by the way. Again, go back to Team A and Team B. There's no mistaking who the good guy is, but we think that if we just stay quiet, that if we just sit idly by and present the facts to you logically, you'll see reality. And then it's impossible that you won't draw the obvious conclusion of who you should be on the side of. There's no way you won't see that Israel is righteous and that the other side are basically satanic murderers. And whether you agree with me or not that that's true, in a PR sense, it doesn't matter if it's true. Because while we're waiting for everyone to look around and go, clearly that's a white hat versus black hat situation in the parlance of cowboy movies, in the meantime, they are waging a PR war, and they are good at it. And they get to see real world and real time results. And them linking up with China, which owns TikTok, which, as we've established, is where over 30% of young people and over 15% of everybody in the United States gets their news, means that they are decimating us on the PR manipulation propaganda front. One example of this is their use of racism. There is a leaked audio of a Muslim propagandist teaching other Muslims how to use propaganda to win this particular war without a shot being fired. They actually use that phrase, we win the war without a shot being fired. Part of it is by appropriating American racism. They saw that after George Floyd, race became the #1 thing people talked about. And they said, even though it does not apply in any way, shape, or form, we are going to present ourselves as the victim class. We are going to say that we fall into this intersectional group over here. We are the Black people. Now, of course, from a race perspective, it's ridiculous. Even though I've heard many people argue with me, we have to stand up for our brown brothers and sisters. There is just as much brown in Israel as there is in Gaza. There are Ethiopian Jews living in Israel. It makes no sense. In fact, the Black people in Gaza, as I mentioned, are often slaves, and the Black people in Israel are citizens. It only makes sense if you have swallowed the bullshit propaganda that they feed you. So, taking it back, one thing the Muslims have done incredibly well is shut down any legitimate criticism of Islam by coining this term, Islamophobia. Now, if there are people out there who are afraid of Muslims, and I don't doubt that there are, or hate them simply because they're Muslim, sure, that should be a problem. And that word would apply, even though it technically means fear, not hatred, but that's fine. But Islam is a religion. Arab is a race. They racialized the religion. So if you are a white Muslim, if you are a Black Muslim, if you're a Muslim that comes from Kentucky, you still can say you're being racist against me, even though I am religiously a Muslim. That is the appropriation of speech. This is 1984 doublespeak at its best. We are going to use the word that we want to use to apply to a situation it doesn't apply to, and we're going to make everybody believe it. 2 + 2 = 5. And then they did the one thing the Jews didn't think to do. They decided if they wanted to hate on the Jews, they couldn't say, we hate Jews. They couldn't say, we hate Israel. So instead, they appropriated a word and added it to our lexicon. They actually gave us a new definition using one of the words that we used prior for something else. That word is Zionist. I won't get into what Zionist actually means because we talked about it in the last video, but by taking Zionist and making it separate from Jew, separate from Israeli, they are able to criticize Jews and Israelis, insult Jews and Israelis, say they hate Jews and Israelis, say they want Jews and Israelis dead, but they get to add the word Zionist. And that way they get to pretend they're not saying what they are saying. Yesterday, the CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman, posted on Twitter he was totally wrong about anti-Semitism, that he was dismissing it, sitting in his leftist bubble, reading all of this propaganda. He assumed it wasn't as bad as it was. And then his eyes were opened. I don't know how, and I don't know why, but I know it happened. And he wrote, and I quote, "For a long time now, I said that anti-Semitism, particularly on the American left, was not as bad as people claimed. I'd like to just state that I was totally wrong. I still don't understand it, really, or know what to do about it, but it is so fucked." The first comment underneath it was, "It seems like you're conflating anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Do better," automatically negating anti-Semitism. Look, all of this Jew hatred, all of the calling for the genocide of the Jews, all of the things that we've been talking about for weeks now isn't what you think it is. Don't believe your lying eyes. It's not anti-Semitism. It's not Jew hatred. It's just anti-Zionism. When people can weaponize language in propagandistic terms, they can do anything they want. The definitions don't matter. Reality doesn't matter. Don't believe what's actually happening in front of you. And by adding this Zionist word, they are able to say there's Jews, there's Israelis, and there's Zionists. Now we can criticize the Jews, we can criticize the Israelis, but we can do it using this other word. That's good PR. That's good propaganda. It's lying, it's dishonest, it's not true, and it makes no sense. But it has become accepted as doctrine amongst many who are just looking for a nice, cute way to not lose their job while still getting down on the Jews. By the way, I'm sure you've noticed by now that I keep saying anti-Semitic and then I add Jew hatred, or I just say Jew hatred. I mentioned this before, but it's another example of propagandistic PR. Islamophobia, that word that they created, fear of Islam, Islam and phobia, right there in the word. There's no mistaking it. Jews made the mistake of, while they said Islamophobia, we're going to make up a word that exactly tells you what's going on. We still use our scientific term, so to speak, our technical term, anti-Semitism. When there is a word or a phrase that is too scientific, it's too technical, it's not clear. If I said to you, hey, is that your Canis lupus familiaris? Would you go, yes? Or would you go, what the hell is that? And then I have to go, oh, right. Is that your dog? But that's why their word is brilliant. And our word, well, there's no Jew in there. There's no hater in there. And when polled, high school students, unless they're Jewish, most of them don't know what an anti-Semite is or what anti-Semitic is. In other words, good PR on their side. Once again, bad PR on ours. Propaganda working, propaganda non-existent. So why am I talking about this? Why am I harping on it so much? Because all of this propaganda leads me back to answering the first question. Why are the Jews seen as the bad guy in this equation? Why are Jews constantly being attacked for all of this? Well, let's go back to some statistics. We talked about how the Muslims are a quarter of the world's population and the Jews are this tiny sliver, 0.2%. But what does that mean in practice? Well, I keep seeing people mention from a visual perspective, you can see how many people are marching on behalf of Jews and how many people are marching on behalf of Muslims. Well, sure, because if every Jew went out and marched on behalf of their own survival, it would still be only 15 million people. And if every Muslim went out and marched on behalf of murdering all the Jews and taking back their homeland genocidally, which is what they do, let's not pretend otherwise, then 2 billion people would be in the streets. And so they're using the optics of that. The optics of, well, I see way more people supporting the Muslims than supporting the Israelis. So therefore, there must be more right on this side than on this side, when all we're talking about is numbers. They readily admit that they make many, many, many more babies than almost anybody else on the planet because they use them as weapons. That's not me saying it. That's not something I'm saying to be a racist. That is something that Muslim mothers say, that other countries use bombs, they use babies because they're better weapons. That's a quote. That's why when you go online, you see much, much more pro-Palestinian, pro-Muslim stuff than you see pro-Jewish stuff. Because again, if every Jew went online and started tweeting simultaneously, you wouldn't see it, because it would be drowned in a sea of 2 billion people, plus whoever else is supporting those 2 billion people, writing. Which is why, for me, as someone who goes online and calls out people's lies and reports on things, it feels like a bad game of whack-a-mole, because every time I get something taken down, and yesterday I received the notice that yes, something I flagged is being deemed racist and is being removed from the internet. But while that was happening, while I was taking the time to report that and explain my reasoning and waiting for them to come back, 1,000 new accounts were made, often with 0 posts, because they're being made just to shout about anti-Semitic slurs and Jew hatred, to spread propaganda, to spread lies. I can't tell you how many times I have seen doctored photos, how many times I have seen information that is just total fabrications online. And if 2 billion people are doing that, then how is it possible for anyone on the 15 million side to fight back? It's just this. It's just one at a time, slowly but surely informing people of the truth and hoping that they are willing to listen. And so hopefully this video is a little bit of a guide. Hopefully this video grants you just enough information for you to be able to refute the bullshit that people come at you with. Every day, someone makes a comment to me, whether it's online or in person, about something that is verifiably false. And it is my job to look at them and tell them, you don't know what you're talking about, and then give them hard facts, statistics, information that cannot be refuted. Now, in many cases, they will ignore it. They will still say this isn't true. As I told you in the last video, people will say, even if you tell me facts, even if you show me statistics, I will still not come over to your side. Those people are Jew haters. You can forget them. But besides those people, There are plenty of others who said, I simply didn't know that. I read this online and I assumed it was true. And so thank you for giving me a piece of information that helps me understand a little bit deeper, helps me understand the situation in a clearer way. And if enough people hear just enough information, the tide will begin to turn. I believe it's already started. Those 3 presidents being called in front of the House was an amazing start, and the reaction has been spectacular. All of them have gone snivelly, grovelly, trying to apologize and take back what they said, even though it's obvious they meant it. All of them are now in danger of losing their jobs, and all of their universities have lost hundreds of millions of dollars in donations as a result of their horrific, hateful testimony. So that's a good thing. Things are starting to change. Take this information and, as they do, use it as a weapon. The only difference is we will use the truth as a weapon, whereas they use lies. And ultimately, I believe the truth will win out. I appreciate you coming back to listen to me for a 3rd time, and I hope you'll do it again. More of these are coming. Thank you. Stay safe, stay strong. Chanukah Sameach, and Am Yisrael Chai.